This is the Dynamics 365 podcast, focusing on the ingredients of a successful Dynamics 365 practice. Your host is Business Solution MVP Mark Smith, otherwise known as NZ365 Guy. This is a special two-part episode with Scott Ward on digital transformation. You will need to check back for part 2 in 2 weeks' time. For more information on this interview, show notes, feedback, and resources mentioned, or to suggest a guest for future episodes, please go to nz365guy.com/podcast. Thanks to CRM UG for sponsoring the Dynamics 365 Practice Podcast. D365 UG and CRM UG is the world's most influential user group community of Microsoft Dynamics 365 and CRM users and partners. Across the globe, members share the common goal of maximizing and advancing the performance of Microsoft Dynamics 365 and CRM so that individuals and companies can improve operations, overcome obstacles, and exceed goals. Hi everyone, I'm here with Scott Ward, and in this episode we're going to be focusing on digital transformation. As the founder and CEO of Digital Infusions, Scott is considered a leader in the area of innovation and digital transformation, specializing in the use of emerging technologies to expedite business strategy. Scott draws from a unique blend of experience in business, technology, and human behavior. His success in large part is thanks to the anchoring belief that despite the rapid explosion of technology, going digital remains a human process. Scott's human-led approach starts by developing a crisp, clean awareness of the outcomes and activities that matter most in business and its people. This insight gives context to the specific behaviors that underpin success. These behaviors are then used to form the foundation of a strategy that is scaled and amplified using emerging technologies. With clients across Australia and North America, Scott works across sectors such as finance, government, technology, telecommunications, construction, health, professional services, and retail, to name a few. Aside from leading Digital Infusions, Scott is also a current recipient of Microsoft Most Valuable Professional Award, the MVP, and is a brand new minted dad. Scott, I'm excited about having you on the podcast.
Thanks, Mark. It's an absolute pleasure.
Okay, so based on the topic, digital transformation, I've known you for a couple of years now, and I know you're passionate about digital transformation. Can you tell me, or really tell our listeners a bit about you? What are you passionate about besides digital transformation?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the things that really sort of get me going in the morning are things around creativity and human creativity in particular. So I absolutely am in awe of some of the stuff that's coming out in the world at the moment and the things that we as a species are doing. So we saw Professor Brian Cox speak the other day, and he was talking about sort of the stuff that's happening in science and our understanding of the galaxy, and that absolutely blows my mind. The things that are happening in the biology space at the moment, so things like the biohacking movement. So really, I'm an aspirational polymath, if you like. Not there yet, but that's something I'd love to be. So anything that is driven through human creativity is something that really inspires me. Aside from that, I love travel and am a long-term traveller. I've been travelling. I spent a number of years on the road a few years ago, travelling through different cultures and countries and just immersing myself in these places. And that's something that is still very important to me and really inspires me on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, good. So Scott, I find digital transformation interesting. If we look to nature at either a tadpole or a caterpillar, they both go through a transformation and become a frog and butterfly respectively. This suggests to me that if companies are serious about digital transformation, the end result could be quite different business, if you like, than what they started out with. What does this mean for business and organizations?
Totally. So there's a couple of things, and I really like those analogies around the tadpole and those sorts of transformational shifts. I think it's completely appropriate. So at the moment, we're kind of caught between these two worlds, right? So we're now living in a highly connected, quite an enabled, technologically enabled universe, if you like, within our world. But most of the businesses that we've got today were actually built prior to the explosion of these technologies. So we've got organisations that were built prior to 2008 and are kind of built in this old world that are now trying to transact in this new. So for me, digital transformation is about rewiring those businesses to be able to compete or to transact effectively in the modern world. Now, there's a couple of caveats to that, and that is that there's two parts or two modes that I talk to around digital transformation. One is acknowledging what's already set up, because those are our existing sources of revenue are the things that actually keep us alive. So we've got to honour that, but they need to be optimised using existing technologies. But the other part of that is that we're in a totally new landscape now, and learning to navigate and to compete effectively in that space, the rules haven't really been written. So the digital transformation piece for me is whilst you're starting to progressively decommission or optimize your existing business, it's about reinventing or reimagining your future business using the skills, capabilities, and assets that you've actually accrued over time, but perhaps taking them in a new direction. And we're starting to see that, like Domino's, the pizza company, for instance, have dropped the pizza piece, and they now see themselves as being essentially a digital play around that business model. So it's around they want to be the primary platform for food delivery businesses, and so they're taking everything that they've done really well that gave them a competitive advantage. They're looking to commoditize it and potentially sell it into their competitors. And I think, and that for me, that's the transformation. It's the progressive decommissioning of what's no longer working, and the harnessing and the extrapolation of the things that you are uniquely good at in a new context or in an extended context.
So that really fits the model of what I was talking about there, because if you take that pizza example, traditionally selling pizza, they create a platform that absolutely works, and then they continue to sell pizza, their core business, but they're pivoting and they're using that technology to sell to other organizations, so new income streams have been developed out of it. Is that right?
Totally. And so at the moment, I don't know if you've used their app, but they've sort of dangled this promise of a $5 pizza in front of you. But it's near impossible to actually stick to that $5 because you actually pull in the ingredients you want, right? But then they've not only have they sort of given you control of what pizza you build, they've knitted together this experience where you can then watch it transition through all the processes up to the point where the bloke's knocking on the door and handing you the pizza. So they've sort of, the way that they've started to use data of things that used to be quite inane in order to knit together an experience that is meaningful to the end user within the context of their need is quite unique. So, and you can see that they're starting to use this information or this data for things like for marketing purposes. So not just for their own marketing purposes, but for audience, like building intelligence around their audience. So they're getting you to answer questions when you're waiting for your pizza and things like that. So they're doing some really amazing things, I think, and quite inventive things. But what I really like about what they've done is that they've taken the inane things that occur, sort of used to occur behind the curtain, and they've pushed it right out to the fringe where the customer is experiencing their product, and they've brought those things to life in a way that is relevant to the customer.
Over the last few years, Microsoft have been talking about digital transformation. Can you tell me what it is? What is it really practically? How would you sum it up? How would you explain it to a layperson?
So Microsoft, I think, in their perspective, they talk about sort of engaging your customers, empowering employees, optimizing operations, and transforming products. And that's kind of they've taken an industry approach to digital transformation, and that does make sense. What I would say, and they're kind of looking at digitizing an existing business. So for me, though, the bit that they've missed in their definition of digital transformation, well, it's a couple of things. One is, like I said before, it's around optimizing your existing business, and that's kind of what the approach that Microsoft has taken. So it makes sense that they're starting to craft these industry-wide solutions and looking for people to specialize in industry X, Y, Z, or whatever it is, and then build solutions up and down the value chain as it relates to that industry. That's part of it. I think the other part of digital transformation is the reinvention or reimagining of your business in new contexts. Now, I believe you have to do both. You can't just do one or the other. So you can't just focus on building the most optimized. We could have the most optimized buggy whip sales business, right? But when the car came along, it doesn't matter how much you optimize that business, it's not going to have helped. So I think whilst you need to optimize that business to squeeze the descriptor that I use, it's kind of like trying to squeeze as much juice out of that orange as you can. And so we want technology to help us maximize the juice that we capture out of that existing business. But at the same time, we want to be building that escape pod to the future and lifting those assets across that we can then take to market in new contexts. For me, digital transformation is both of those aspects being run concurrently. And I actually believe that digital transformation is actually going to be business as usual from now on. So the explosion of technologies that we're seeing and the sort of coalescence of these major trends are starting to impact and leverage the capability or the enablement that each of these other trends are starting to unlock, right? So we've got this exponential sort of innovation piece at the moment. So I think that the ability to simultaneously decommission an existing business over time and to get as much juice out of that orange whilst reimagining and reinventing your future business, the ability to do those concurrently is the new business management skill set.
Okay, that makes sense. So tell me, why should organizations care about it though?
I think there's so much information now about we're going through this mass extinction of businesses. So there was some Harvard Business Review studied something like 30,000 businesses and discovered that 50% of the businesses that were listed in the year 2000 are no longer there. So 50% have gone since just in the last 18 years. And another third of today's listed businesses are expected to go within the next 5 years. And then we talk about life expectancy of businesses going from 56 years to 18 and all that kind of stuff. So there's what we're seeing is, in the most polite term, is a mass contraction of the life expectancy of our businesses. So if we're statistically speaking, if our business is more than 18 years old, theoretically we're actually above the average. So we can't assume that the things that have, or the environments that have supported us to date, are going to continue to exist into the future. And we need to be proactive about how we shift our businesses to keep them relevant over time. And that's honestly, that's the thing that I think, that's the most pressing reason to make sure that companies are caring about this, is because they have to.
It's a survival thing.
Totally, yeah.
So tell me, what do you see though as the hype that is coming out of digital transformation opposed to the reality?
So the hype for me is that everything is now digital transformation. If you're upgrading your project management system, that's digital transformation. Now, if you're getting if you're going from version A of a particular product to version B, that's digital transformation. Everything has been stuck with this label of digital transformation, and it's not. So for me, unless you're taking a coordinated approach between managing those two modes that I talked about before, so mode 1 is the squeezing the orange and mode 2 is that escape pod to the future, unless you're proactively managing a suite of programs down both of those different modes of operation, then it's not digital transformation, it's just a point solution. And so I think there's a need to start to knit together a lot of the strategic initiatives that these businesses are undertaking and giving them context within a broader shift. And that's, for me, unless you've got context within a broader shift, it's not digital transformation.
So you've talked about the two modes there. One, the concept of automating, making things run faster, better, leaner, that type of thing. And then, of course, the escape pod, or what is the future view or the transition the business needs to go through. So what problems does digital transformation do you see solving apart from those two areas?
So there's a couple of, it's a really interesting question, actually. I think there's a couple of parts to that. So I think in the mode 1 piece that I talk about, the orange one, what we're essentially solving there is business problems. So we've got all these inconsistencies and frictions that exist within our current businesses, and it's kind of they've been created because the hierarchies and the structures that we built previously that used to serve us so well are now can't actually compete or move as quickly as we need them to. So I think there's all sorts of frictions within that. So the knowledge flows in these old businesses have totally been surpassed by these new working practices. And so we see that with the advent of enterprise social like Yammer and Teams and those sorts of platforms. That like Teams from if you look at it from a collaboration perspective, that you use Teams around when you need cohesion in something that you're trying to execute against, right? So it's that group of people that are trying to drive that target over that time span. Now that as a communications platform is infinitely more efficient than say email or maybe phone sometimes within context, and certainly faxes and those sorts of things. And then with the likes of Yammer, like you use Yammer when you need diversity. So if you're looking to innovate at scale and to leverage the collective intelligence at scale, then those sorts of technologies need to be implemented and leveraged effectively in order to shift those working practices from that old world into the current. So that's kind of the first part of that. But and so the mode one really is about solving those business problems and the inefficiencies of information flow. And that is not just about people to people, but it's also about people to information or data. So it's that connectivity piece. The other side, the mode 2 piece, is really around solving customer problems. Now, what I find is that quite often in businesses, like businesses that are very clear about the problem they solve for their customers, and get clear about sort of redefining it within the granularity of the context. And I'll come back to granularity in a second because I think it's an important concept. Those companies that take their point of identification from that, it's looking about how can we actually take the things that we do and that actually create unique value and pump them into that moment. And it's sort of at that pointy end, the customer problems are actually like that's where the frontier is today. We're uncovering what is the actual need that we're servicing, and we're getting deeper and deeper and deeper into it. So, and so those are the two sets of problems: the business problems and then the customer problems. If I just round back quickly to that granularity piece, one of the big trends that I'm seeing within that digital transformation needs to address is this explosion of granular technology. And what I mean by that is we've gone from this world where, say, you wanted to book a trip overseas, right? When I was a kid, if I wanted to do that, I absolutely had to go to a travel agent. So my ability to access that service was dependent upon going to a particular point, like a geography, a defined geography. Then we had desktops, so I could then access that same service from either at home in my home office or at work. We've now got mobile, so no longer do I need to go to a geography or be at my home. It's now delivered into my pocket. And so in the next sort of horizons of technologies, we've got ingestibles and injectable technologies. So the ability to access a service within the context of a moment has been greatly enabled, and that's the ability to access things in a granular way, and that's what I mean by granularity, is a key trend that I think businesses need to be aware of when they're coming into this. Because if you're focusing all your efforts in building a physical geography, the best physical footprint, you're opening yourself up to being bunny hopped, if you like, into these other into this shifting competitive front.
Yeah, definitely makes for an interesting future ahead of us. What's your opinion on digital transformation? Is it a one-off project, or is it more of a journey of change to become digital? And what does it look like? And I want to ask this. I know you've said before, digital is going to be business as usual going forward. But I was reading in Gartner recently, and they said that the digital officer in 2018 would become irrelevant, something to that effect, as though the digital trend was going to move on. What are your thoughts?
I don't see it happening at the moment. I think the reason why I think it's going to become business as usual is because I don't think we've exhausted the explosion of innovation that we're seeing around us. The day that the sort of those that, talked about the coalescence of tech trends and how those tech trends are now starting to, as AI comes up, it's opening up these new horizons of enablement, which is then being used by Internet of Things. So you're sort of getting this clash of trends, right? The day that the innovation of those trends starts to plateau, then we'll start to get to a more stable business landscape. But until that point, I think we're going to be in this space where digital transformation is business as usual, and it's going to be a never-ending process. And it's what's really fascinating about this is if you look at sort of the unicorns, so those companies that were born in this space, like the Airbnbs and the Ubers and that sort of stuff, you would think that they've sort of dominated the market and they're going to be indomitable from now on, but it's so far from the truth. So whilst they're really good at sort of this mode 2 scalable amplified business models, what they're not so good at is the mode 1 discipline. So they've kind of got issues going the other way, if you like. But they still need to be able to commoditize or codify the business practices that become standard, and drive efficiencies over those, which is a mode 1 practice, while still reinventing themselves as these new technologies like driverless vehicles come available. So there's, nobody is spared from this. Like, everybody has to address it.
Yeah. So where does a business start if they're wanting to get past the hype of what they're hearing constantly around digital transformation, and they, in practical terms, want to start, realize, yes, we need to do something. What are kind of steps that they should take to begin that journey?
So there's a couple of things actually. What you'll find that the typical business that hasn't started this journey at the moment usually are fixated in driving efficiencies down their model. So they're trying to sort of screw down their cost of suppliers. They're trying to minimise sort of their staffing levels in order to provide a maximum experience, and they're trying to maximise their cost of acquisition from a new customer perspective. So it's all about the fixation in those businesses. It's usually about driving efficiencies against an existing practice. So that actually sits as quite counter to a lot of the skills and experiences of these new reimagined businesses. So in an old business, a lot of the practices will be around Six Sigma or things like sort of traditional MBA programs, right? It's all about efficiencies. Whereas these new businesses are all about opening up to new possibilities, so design thinking and all that sort of stuff. So there's a mismatch of skills, right? So the first thing I think for a business that hasn't undergone this sort of initiative is to understand that there's going to be things, or to accept that there's going to be things in your existing business that aren't as they need to be. So you're not necessarily in the best of positions. But I think that the easy starting point is to do things like start to connect your employees through social technologies. Start to go to the cloud. So what we're seeing is the ability to pick, and when you're picking a provider, a tech provider, what people don't realize is you're picking an ecosystem, right? So it doesn't matter what tech provider you choose, the features and functions of the programs that are on offer today will be very different in 6 months. Yeah. So when you're choosing a provider, you're actually choosing an innovation methodology or pathway. So look at who your providers are. I personally believe you need to have there's going to be value in having a homogeneous data ecosystem going forward, because that's going to allow you to move and leverage much faster than if you've got to reconcile all these different sort of a patchwork of data ecosystems. But understanding that that's what you're really choosing, committing to it, and looking to start to transition assets that allow you to scale more effectively, which essentially means going to the cloud. Now, once you've started that process, you've got your audiences connected, and audiences is primarily employees, potentially up and downstream partners and maybe customers, but definitely employees. You want to start an innovation process to get out of your own way, right? So one of the things that works best for us when we go into organizations is we run a dumbest things initiatives. That's essentially, we ask the question, what are the dumbest things that we're doing in this business today? And invariably, a lot of the stuff that comes out are pretty dumb things. Some of it, is set up the way that it needs to be for good reason, so we report back what that is. But quite often, when you're trying to drive innovation, people struggle with the blue sky, but they can really tell you the things that are annoying them today, and those are the things where we're losing productivity. So we want to get them up, get them on the table, and we want to start to resolve those in an environment that is constructive. So if it's an environment where we're starting to drive blame for these things, then what you're telling other people is that it's not safe to offer suggestions. You need to keep your head down. So we've got to build a constructive environment where we can unearth these things and start to drive them through the business. That's the very first step. The second step, I'd say, is starting to get knowledgeable about the need that you actually service. So it's sort of a data insights engine at your customer-facing piece of the business.
So what tools are you seeing out there used to help people on this digital transformation journey?
So many. So what we're seeing, if I can, I'll just talk about the sort of the horizons of technology, and then I'll wrap it back to and within that, it's the tools that we're seeing. I think we've kind of come from this world where we had this functional layer of technology where every different business unit had its own unique tool set and its own unique database. What we're seeing sits across the top of that now is this social layer, be it things like Teams or Yammer, that can actually offer transparency and start to shift the human knowledge or the tacit knowledge, or unlock the tacit knowledge that sits within our organisation. But above that, we're now seeing these systems of enablement. So within the context of that functional technology and that social technology, we've got this richness of data, right? And in all this data, there's the insight that leads to, or the signature, if you like, of excellence. So what we're seeing in the functional layer is the unearthing of this data as it relates to excellence, that then starts to enable point-in-time decision-making, or sort of that behavioural alignment at scale through things like approaches like gamification. So and that then points to, so we've got those functional tools, and I think they're really important. The social tools are really important, but then the sort of the data, the sense making piece, and that can be that can be SQL at the back end and those sort of data lake concepts, or it can be the data visualization things, and that enablement layer is, I believe, is the thing that's really been built out now for industries. So when you look at, say, Microsoft as an ecosystem, and I think it's more an ecosystem than a stack, to be honest. It's an incredible Lego kit, but that enablement layer is the construction of that Lego kit in order to bring business intelligence to the surface and make it actionable. And that enablement layer, I think, is the most important layer that's been built at the moment. And I think that's if you want to start a business, that's where you start.
I'd like to drill into the tools which are more soft skills, if you like, around creating the discussion inside organizations, uncovering, if you like, or exposing what they don't know and the journey they need to go on. What are some of the soft skill type methodologies you're using to facilitate that discussion?
Yeah, so there's a thing, and like I said, I sort of touched on it before, the dumbest things, that actually points to a style of leadership that I'm looking for a name for it, but I think it's the best I've got at the moment is this provocative style of leadership. So I'm very fortunate in that I've been able to work across, organisations around Australia and North America, and I get to work with the best of the best and those that are just starting their journey. So everything in between, right? Now, the thing that I'm seeing that the best of the best do, that their leaders do, is a couple of things. One is, and it goes to how they engage. Like there's a couple of traits of engagement that are quite particular to high performers, and that is so they update regularly. So that's the first thing. They also engage and start to respond to people actively, and this is visibly, and that's the sort of that points to the value of social. But the other thing that they do that I find that's really valuable is that they they'll do things like, so David Thodey jumped onto Yammer this day. So David Thodey is the ex-CEO of Telstra, which is Australia's largest telco. It's 40,000 people. And he jumped on and he literally said, what are the top 10 dumbest sign-offs and permissions that we ask for in this business? And what he's actually doing is he's putting out a challenge, and then he's drawing this sort of vacuum that provides permission for others to participate in. And this kind of provocative vacuum, I think, that's the trait that I see in top performers that is missing in others. And I'll give you another example. Guillaume Swiggers, who's the ex-CEO of Deloitte in Australia, was on. Actually, I'll tell you there's a story about Guillaume Swiggers. He's in his current business. He's now the CEO of Oricon. But one of his first posts in Oricon was he jumped on. He grabbed Oricon's whatever their tagline is, and he said, it's Oricon best in the world. He threw that into Yammer and said, our tagline is best in the world. Does it mean anything, or is it absolute garbage? And it just lit this fire through the business with people going, no, it doesn't mean anything, hasn't meant anything for ages, and others coming back going, no, it's completely important for these reasons. But what he's actually done in a really clever way is he's been really provocative. He's drawn this vacuum around an awareness of who are we? What do we stand for? What's important to us? And I think that CEOs that are kind of struggling with this try and rule change by mandate, yeah. Whereas those that are high performing draw this vacuum that brings the awareness out of the people that they're leading, and that one behaviour trait is the most powerful thing I've seen to drive behaviour change at scale. And so that for me is one of the differentiating soft skills. I mean, there's others as well around. We talked before about the ability to feel safe in contributing, and that provocative leadership goes a long way to establishing that environment where it's okay to offer suggestions that might not be convenient. But it's that sort of, and it's a very inspiring leadership trait. That for me. If you've got that and they're updating their people and they're engaging their people and they're being provocative, that becomes a behaviour that is highly contagious and actually gives permission from the coalface all the way up through the leadership stack to start enacting change. And actually, I wrote a post on it about are your leaders up to the job? And talked about how when you go into these businesses, you can tell if how enabled the leaders are within the first sort of 30 minutes of the conversation. So if the people there are focused on the number of sign-offs that they need to get in order to enact the value that you're offering them, then you know that they're a long way back on their journey. But if they start talking about the people that would benefit from that value, and it's there's an active empowerment to implement of their own accord, then you know that you're going to be able to move quickly with that customer.
So tell me, what type of organizations do you see embracing it now and really, if you like, they're out, they're running, they're underway?
There's a bit to that. So we're seeing some really large-scale organizations that are starting to drive effective transformations in this space. I think GE, even for all the contention that they've had recently, their ability to commoditize their systems of intelligence down their manufacturing line and take that to market as they can offer to their competitors. I think that's an example. But what I'm seeing actually is that it's the exception rather than the rule in these big businesses. Quite often, some of the best stuff that's happening and the most inventive stuff that's happening in the market is mid to or small to medium businesses where the original founder is still in charge of the business and there's a permission to actually move and to make a difference. Those are the ones that I'm seeing that are moving the fastest. I think part of the issue is these large businesses, they're like these, they're a selection of clustered business models, which makes it really tough. So with these big sort of, like an example is, let's say, a petrochemical company that not only do they sort of pull oil out of the ground, they sell petrol to people, and they've got financing arms attached to it. So it's a cluster of business models, and trying to shift and drive change within that context is really tough, right? Because well, a couple of all sorts of reasons, but one of the main reasons is that we're so measured on our business as usual initiatives that we're not actually given permission to change. So what those businesses then do is they often spin out an incubator. But the challenge with incubators is that it's kind of like it's a false environment. So you've kind of got this, like in the startup sector, it's a pretty ruthless space, right? You need to add value from day one or you die. But within the incubation sector, you've kind of got your wage is not under threat, so you don't actually feel the pangs of going hungry. So it's kind of like taking all these zoo animals and going hunting, which is going to sound like a really derogatory term for people, but it's the most accurate that I can find. Right? If you're in a startup and you go hungry, you figure it out, right? And so I'm seeing these large organisations are getting hamstrung a little bit by the complexity of their organisations. So the way that they're starting to do it effectively, and we're kind of drifting into different types of. This is the mode 2 piece, and there's different ways of structuring and sort of how you drive that as a function. But we're seeing a lot more partnering by large organisations with startups and allowing startups to come in and being the first customer, if you like, for those startups and allowing them to use your business as a platform to get their products right. And I think there's people that are doing good things in the space. I talk about GE, we talk about Domino's, and they're large businesses, but they're far from having it perfected. So Lego, Disney, all these businesses are doing great things, but even with Lego, we've seen recently, even though they were sort of the champions of transformation before, they're now hitting a point where they're getting stuck, and so they've hit a sort of a bump in the road, if you like. So we can point to these people today, but that's not to say that they'll be there tomorrow. So I think and that's why the sort of the mid cap with the founder that's still in charge has such an advantage in this market, is because they can give permission and they can allocate resources to pursue something that didn't exist yesterday, and that's a lot harder to do in a big business.
So if we're looking at various industries, in your view, who are the leaders, as in not so much the companies, but what are the industry sectors that you see really leading in the space of digital transformation over others?
So there's a couple. I think media are getting very savvy. They were like the canaries in the coal mine in terms of this digital change, and so we've got organisations that went from print media into digital. And so a lot of those businesses have already gone through this process once when they went online. They're now more adept at this change, but it doesn't mean that they're immune to disruption. So media are doing well. It's a tough question mark, because the caveat to that is like Facebook and Netflix, these guys are essentially the media companies that didn't exist a few years ago that are now dominating. But if you're looking at traditional businesses that are adapting and adopting effectively, I think that's a niche. The other ones that I'm seeing, the other ones that I'm seeing that are doing pretty well, I think, retailers, they're under duress, but a lot of them are actually learning how to transact effectively in the digital space. We've just, like this week, we've had Amazon come into Australia, right, which is a massive upset. But if you look at and they're catching these traditional retailers off guard. But if you look at how like a retailer has gone from owning physical premises to being able to transact in the online space, they're probably more ahead than many other industries. Finance is doing some interesting things, but even then, so we've got CBA, one of the largest banks in Australia, are throwing huge amounts of money at reworking their digital customer journey, and they're doing really good things there. Like some of the stuff that they're producing is brilliant. But even then, sort of Ian Narev, their CEO, comes out just, I think it was about 6 months ago, and says we're yet to do a single innovation. So it's a tough question. So these guys are doing well, but it doesn't mean they're winning. and it doesn't mean they're losing either. But I just find it's a really tough question to answer because it's so complex. But they're doing great things, but they're not necessarily winning, which I find again is fascinating.
So looking at the traditional bell curve, who are the laggards? Who are the people that are not going to do anything till potentially it's too late? And once again, I'm looking at industries here that just seem to be really slow in doing anything around engaging in the way the market is changing.
Things like real estate, I think, is a slow beast to change. Even though I pointed to retail a second ago as starting to move pretty well, I think parts of retail are just absolute laggards. And maybe that's the answer, right? Is that within any industry, we've got those that are absolutely driving it ahead, going gangbusters, and those that are still laggards within industry. I think, mining has done pretty well with IoT, but I'm yet to see them evolve their business model. And I think that's so. The other laggards, I think, like I've talked about banks before, they're doing things that are really amazing. Insurance is doing things that are amazing, but then there's still those others that are within those industries that are still trying to sell old school insurance policies. And this is, and I kind of think this, we talked before about how mode one is around progressive decommissioning of existing businesses, whilst the reimagining. So you can actually, I guess it's fair that you can point within industries that organisations are up to different points within that process. Because the other one that I would point the finger at actually is technology providers, and that seems really ironic. But there's a lot of tech providers, and they're usually partners of these large organisations, that are still there trying to sell on-site licenses. Whereas they've got a front row seat to this change, but they're still hanging on for grim life to these old business models because that impacts where their kids go to school and all that kind of stuff for all good reasons. But they're not, and they're struggling to transition into this new mode of operation that actually is infinitely more powerful than what went before. But the business model and the mechanizations of commercialization are not quite as crisp and clear as what's went before. So it's a really tough one to answer from an industry perspective. But in the industries that I've outlined, I've been incredibly generalist, and because there are fast movers in all of those as well.
So the ones that are not moving, why do you think they're not engaging? As in, they fundamentally, being the ostrich, head in the sand, hopefully it will go away, or is it, dare I say, organizations that maybe have an elder level of management that thinks they know the way that business is done, and this is the way we've always done it, and this works, and we'll be doing it this way in 10 years' time. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, actually, the utility businesses are the ones that are often lagging as well, that I see. What you've just touched on there is that quite often what I'm seeing is the laggards. There's a couple of characteristic traits, and there's different reasons why they're laggards. Some is because, like in the hotel sector at the moment, Airbnb has totally changed the game, right? So if you're an old school hotel, your revenue is going out backwards because you've got all this increased competition, and it's competition from people that aren't married into the same business model. So if you're an old school hotel, revenue is going out, but you still have to have the Egyptian cotton sheets. You still need to have the staff at the bar and the breakfast buffet. So, and you still need to pay your travel agents the cost, their commission for bringing on new customers. So you're married into a legacy of spend in these businesses. So they're under huge pressure because they've got to do more with less, so the pressure's never been greater. But because that your existing business model is going to die. What do you do about it? Because suddenly you don't have the same sort of breathing space that you used to. So that's one thing. And so quite often what happens is we become frozen with fear. We see these people get frozen with fear. Or the other response that I see from those businesses sometimes is they double down and they try and do twice as much of the things that they used to do that no longer work. Because that's what they've always done. But the thing that you touched on before too is there's some layers of leadership that are I'm retiring in 5 years. It's going to be somebody else's problem. I don't want to rock the boat. I can see the end of the tunnel from a work perspective, and they're just trying to get by to the end, like trying to serve their time and get to the end without having to disturb their life too much because their runs are on the board, so to speak. So they're kind of some of the reasons that I'm seeing the laggards. Anything from fear to the head in the sand thing, which is the doubling down and doing double of what we've always done, or the end is in sight. So I think I'm just going to take my foot off the gas for a little while.
It's interesting because it really puts an onus on directors and that layer of the business to see that and actually take effective action, I suppose. Another question here, how long do you think this wave is going to exist? What will be the end result? If you could predict what the business or organizational environment will be in the next 5 to 10 years?
So I think we're going to continue to see considerable upheaval in the market. I think we're going to start to see businesses transition into areas that they didn't used to compete in, specifically in areas of technology. So I think GE's play to become the largest provider of manufacturing technology is kind of going to be a standard play, and we're seeing Domino's shift into becoming a provider of food delivery technologies as well, or B2C delivery technologies as well is going to become the standard. So we're going to see these guys that have taken a competitive edge and commoditized them into technology plays. I think that's going to become standard. But the other thing I think we're going to start to see is if I was a big player, so Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Apple, more the first three. I'll park Apple for a second because they're a bit of a different beast. I think as there's a fear that in the market that if we partner with these big providers that they're going to somehow take what we do and then commercialize it. I think the reality is that these players would rather buy those people out. So I think as we go to the cloud, what we're actually and these big providers are incentivized on consumption, right? So they want to see us using their tools and technologies. If you flip that around from a business perspective, it actually means that they're going to have the data over which businesses are the most active. And so I think from an acquisition perspective, I think they're going to have some very attractive data sets over which businesses to buy and which ones to neglect. So I actually think we're going to see a significant consolidation of the building of these monopolies in ways that we would never have imagined. So like Amazon at the moment, which was selling books originally, is suddenly a technology company, is suddenly a retail business, is suddenly they're setting up retail stores. They're actually starting to build out their ecosystem in these sort of multi-dimensional ways, and I think we're going to see more and more and more of that from these large tech providers.
This is a special 2-part episode with Scott Ward on digital transformation. You've just listened to part 1. Check back in 2 weeks for part 2. This has been a Dynamics 365 podcast focusing on the ingredients of successful Dynamics 365 practice. Your host was Business Solution MVP Mark Smith, otherwise known as the NZ365 Guy. For more information on this interview, show notes, feedback and resources mentioned, or if you know someone who would be a great guest for future episodes, please go to nz365guy.com/podcast and leave me a message.